My job is reading wreckage. When a plane goes down, I'm one of the people who walks the debris field with a clipboard and a camera, marking where every piece landed, because every piece landed somewhere for a reason. I've spent 11 years learning that disasters don't happen in a single moment. They happen in a sequence. A bolt fatigues. A warning gets ignored. A log entry goes missing. By the time anything falls out of the sky, the crash has usually been underway for years. I'm telling you this so you'll understand how I found out my husband had denied our son existed. Nobody said it to my face. Nobody raised their voice. I found it the way I find everything. In the paperwork. My name is Reese Calloway. I'm 36, I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and last March my son Eli arrived 7 weeks early, at 33 weeks, in an operating room at Saltmarsh Regional while my husband's phone went to voicemail. Colin was at a cardiology conference in Atlanta. That's what the text said, anyway. Dr. Colin Ashford, pediatric cardiologist, the man half this town trusted with their children's hearts. When I married him, people congratulated me like I'd won something. He sent flowers to the maternity wing before I was even out of recovery. The card read, "You two are my whole world. Home Friday." He didn't come home Friday. Eli weighed 4 pounds, 1 ounce. They took him to the NICU before I ever held him, and for the first 3 days my entire existence narrowed down to a plastic box, a tangle of leads on a chest smaller than my hand, and the green line of a monitor I learned to read like scripture. Colin called twice a day. His voice was warm, unhurried, full of the right questions. What's his oxygen at? Is he tolerating feeds? He knew exactly which questions a worried father would ask. I remember thinking he sounded like a man reading from a very good script, and then I remember hating myself for thinking it. My brother Theo works the ER 2 floors down from the NICU. He's 4 years younger than me and has never once in his life let a silence sit. He came up on every break, still in scrubs, and held Eli's foot through the porthole in the incubator because that was the only part of him you were allowed to touch. On day 3, a billing coordinator named Denise appeared at the NICU family desk with a folder and an apologetic expression I've since learned to associate with incoming shrapnel. There was an issue with Eli's coverage. He'd been enrolled under my federal plan, which was fine, but the hospital's system had flagged something odd. There was no paternal enrollment at all. No secondary coverage. Nothing pending. That made no sense. Colin worked for this hospital system. Adding a newborn to an employee plan takes 10 minutes and a birth date. I said there must be a processing delay. Denise looked at her folder a beat too long and said she'd recheck it. Theo didn't wait for the recheck. That night he pulled up the enrollment status the way staff can, through the internal portal, tied to Colin's employee file, number 40871. I watched his face change while he read the screen. There was no delay. There was a declination. Colin hadn't forgotten to add Eli. He had formally declined dependent coverage for him. There's a checkbox for it. He'd checked it. I told myself there was an explanation. Tax strategy. Some coordination of benefits thing. I'm embarrassed by how hard I worked on his behalf, standing in a hallway at midnight. Building him alibis he hadn't even asked for. The envelope ended the alibis. It came to the house 9 days after Eli was born, forwarded from the county, one of those procedural copies that exist because the law believes everyone deserves notice. Inside was a single document. A sworn affidavit, signed by Colin M. Ashford, stating under penalty of perjury that he was not the father of the child carried by Reese Calloway, and that he declined any acknowledgement of paternity. I read it standing at my kitchen table. Then I did what I do at a crash site. I stopped feeling and started documenting. Date of signature. Notary stamp. County of execution. And that's where the floor moved under me. Because the notarization date was 2 weeks before Eli was born. He hadn't panicked in some awful moment after the delivery. He had driven to a notary while I was on bed rest, while his son was still inside me, and sworn the boy away in advance, I didn't call him. I want you to understand that, because everyone expects the screaming phone call, and I understood even that first night that the phone call was what he'd prepared for. You don't confront a discrepancy at the wreckage. You map it first. I spread the hospital paperwork across the table under the kitchen light, and there in the middle of it sat Eli's birth certificate worksheet, every line filled in except one. Father. Blank. A white rectangle that took up about half an inch of paper and the entire center of my chest. I made one vow over that blank line. I was not going to beg this man to sign it. I was going to find out why he wouldn't. The first answer came from Denise, 3 days later, when I went down to billing to close out Eli's file. She was trying to be kind. She said, and I could tell the second it left her mouth that she regretted it, that the declination had actually confused her too, because Dr. Ashford's dependent coverage wasn't empty. His plan already listed a spouse and 2 children. I stood very still and asked her to repeat that, a spouse. 2 children. On file for years, I have been the only Mrs. Anything in that man's life for 6 years. And I have never had 2 children. Denise couldn't tell me more than that. She shouldn't have told me what she did, and we both knew it, so I thanked her, walked to my car, and sat in the parking deck for 20 minutes without turning the key. A spouse and 2 children on a benefits file isn't a rumor. It isn't lipstick on a collar. It's an entry in a database that someone typed in deliberately, years ago, and renewed every open enrollment season since. Whoever that spouse was, Colin had been claiming her on paper the entire time he'd been married to me. Here's the thing about my husband that I want you to understand, because it's the thing that ended him. Colin documented everything. Not out of caution. Out of vanity. Every conference badge went into a drawer like a trophy. Every reimbursement was filed to the penny. His phone held 11,000 photos, backed up to a cloud account we technically shared because I'd set it up for him one Christmas when he couldn't figure out the storage settings. He photographed hotel breakfasts. He photographed parking garages so he wouldn't lose the car. He kept 9 years of mileage logs for the tax deduction. He thought of it as being organized. I recognized it, eventually, for what it really was. A flight data recorder he'd been carrying in his own pocket, while Eli slept in a bassinet beside my desk. Breathing on his own now, gaining ounces like they were metals, I started pulling the records. Nothing stolen, nothing hacked. Joint tax files. The shared cloud account. Credit card statements with my name on them. Reimbursement summaries he'd printed and left in the filing cabinet in our garage, because of course he had. I cleared the pegboard where he hung his bike gear and I built a timeline wall, the same way I'd build one for a wreck. Date left. Date returned. Stated destination. Verified destination. The stated destination said Atlanta, Charleston, Baltimore, a rotating list of cardiology conferences. The gas receipt said something else. The gas receipt said Interstate 95 North. The photo metadata said it louder. Hundreds of pictures, stripped of context but not of coordinates, clustered around the same patch of map 300 miles from our front door. Richmond, Virginia, not once. Not an affair's worth of weekends. Every second week. Alternating like a shift schedule, going back through every year of our marriage and past it, back 9 years. I stood in my garage looking at a pattern so regular you could set a watch by it, and I understood that I had never been married to a man with a secret. I was the secret. Or at best, I was one of 2 parallel lives run by a man disciplined enough to keep both trains on time. I did not confront him. I want to be honest about how hard that was. Because the night I mapped the Richmond cluster, he called from his conference, and I held the phone and let him tell me about a keynote speaker I already suspected didn't exist, and I said, "Sounds exhausting, honey," in a voice I didn't recognize as mine. Instead, I hired a lawyer. Yolanda Pierce, family law, recommended by a colleague, a woman who listens with her pen down and doesn't perform sympathy. I put the affidavit and my timeline in front of her, and she read for 10 minutes before saying a word. Then she said 2 things I'll never forget. First, whatever you're tempted to do with his phone or his email, don't. The moment you break a law, you become the story. Second, and this was the one that changed everything, he's trying to erase this child. So we don't fight the erasure. We flip it. We file to establish paternity. Court-ordered DNA. If that baby is his, the state will write his name on that certificate whether he likes it or not, and his sworn affidavit becomes a very serious problem for him. He wanted off the record. We were going to nail him to it. The petition was filed on a quiet Tuesday in April, stamped and dated, a fact that would matter enormously later, though I didn't know it yet. Colin came home that Friday with flowers and a stuffed elephant for Eli, and for 2 weeks he performed fatherhood beautifully, holding the baby just long enough for a photo. And I performed the tired, grateful wife, and the two of us sat across a dinner table lying to each other in complete harmony. Every night he told me some small detail about his week, and every night I went out to the garage afterward and pinned it to the wall to check it against the receipts. Then the county records search I'd been running came back. There was a property in Richmond, a 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac, purchased 8 years ago. I read the ownership line 4 times, recorded owners, C. and M. Ashford. He hadn't just been visiting Richmond. He owned a home there. With her, I drove to Richmond on a Saturday. I told Colin I was taking Eli to my mother's for the weekend. Which was half true, because I did drop him there, along with a diaper bag and a lie about needing to catch up on sleep. My mother looked at me a moment too long when I said it. I'd been dodging her calls for weeks. Theo's too. Somewhere in the middle of building that garage wall, I'd decided this investigation was mine alone to carry, the same way I'd decided at 9 years old, the year my own father drove off, that needing people was a design flaw. I filed everyone who loved me under later. Remember that. It's going to cost me 5 hours up Interstate 95, the same asphalt Colin's gas receipts had been quietly confessing to for 9 years. The cul-de-sac was exactly what the county record promised. Brick colonial, basketball hoop over the garage, a wreath on the door in April because some households never stop decorating. I parked 4 houses down like every amateur in every movie, and I didn't have to wait long, because Saturday morning in a neighborhood like that has a schedule, and my husband was on it. He came out of the front door of a house I had never seen, in a maroon polo shirt I had never washed, carrying a mesh bag of soccer balls. 2 kids ran out behind him. A boy around 10, a girl maybe 7, both dark-haired, both loud, both reaching for him like he was the best part of their morning. And behind them, locking the door with the ease of someone who had locked it 10,000 times. A woman in a ball cap and a quilted vest. I followed them to a park 6 blocks away and stood at a chain-link fence with a coffee I never drank, watching Dr. Colin Ashford coach youth soccer. He knew every child's name. He high-fived the ones who missed. When the little girl scored, he scooped her up and spun her, and the whole sideline of parents laughed, and the woman in the ball cap shot video on her phone, glowing, and I stood on the wrong side of that fence doing arithmetic I couldn't stop. The boy was 10. Colin and I had been married 6 years. That child existed before I ever met him. Every anniversary I'd had, she'd already had 4. Here's what nobody prepares you for. I expected to feel rage looking at him. What I felt watching him lift that little girl was closer to grief, because in 14 months of fatherhood available to him, he had held Eli maybe 6 times, and always facing a camera. Whatever this man was performing in Richmond, he performed it better than anything he'd ever given us. Or maybe, and this was the thought that actually bent me in half against my car afterward, maybe Richmond was the real life. Maybe Wilmington was the performance. I should have driven home. Instead, I did the one thing Yolanda would have forbidden if I'd told her, which I hadn't, because see above, design flaw. That afternoon, once Colin's car left for what the pattern told me would be his drive back to me, I knocked on the colonial's door. The woman answered with a dish towel over her shoulder. Up close she was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of tired that comes from competence, not chaos. I said I needed to talk to her about Colin. I got maybe 40 seconds in. I had documents in my hand, actual paper, and she never looked at them, because she'd stopped listening at the word married. She laughed at me. Not cruelly. Worse than cruelly, with certainty. She said she'd been warned about this, that a woman from a medical billing scam had been harassing doctors' families, and wasn't it convenient I'd shown up the one weekend he was traveling. She said her husband had been at a conference in Atlanta. That he called her every night, and that if I came near her children she would have a patrol car here in 4 minutes. Then the door closed. Not a slam. A firm, practiced, suburban click, which is somehow louder. I sat in my car and understood something that made me respect and pity her at the same time. She wasn't a fool. She was me. She had her own stack of alibis she'd been maintaining on his behalf, her own wall of small stones. He called her every night. He called me every night too. The man ran 2 households on one script, and both of us had been grading his performance against the wrong answer key. The real blow landed the following week, back home, in a records office with humming lights. If I was going to prove a first marriage, I needed the license. Virginia keeps them. So do the counties. I searched Richmond, then the surrounding counties, then the state index, for any marriage on record for Colin Ashford. The clerk slid the printout back across the counter with the flat kindness of government employees everywhere. No record found. I widened it. North Carolina. Maryland. Nothing. According to every registry on the eastern seaboard, Colin Ashford had married exactly one woman in his life. Me, Yolanda, was blunt about what that meant. Without a license, I had a paternity case and a pile of gas receipts. A man visiting a woman and her kids isn't a crime. Ashford on a deed isn't a marriage. If I walked into court claiming bigamy with no document, his lawyers would feed me my own credibility. I sat in my garage that night, alone by my own stubborn design, staring at a wall of evidence that had just gone quiet on me. And then the investigator in me finally spoke up over the wife in me. At a crash site, when a maintenance record is missing, the record usually isn't missing. You're searching the wrong tail number, because somewhere along the line, somebody renamed the aircraft. There was no marriage license for Colin Ashford, so who was he before he was Colin Ashford? Before I could chase that question, Colin answered a different one for me. The question of what kind of man I was actually dealing with. The paternity petition finally reached him through his attorney in mid-May. I braced for shouting, for a suitcase, for the mask ripping off at our kitchen table. I got none of that. Colin came home, kissed my forehead, and said, very gently, that he was worried about me. That filing legal actions against your own husband wasn't rational behavior. That he'd been talking to people who cared about us. He said it the way you'd talk to a patient's frightened mother. Calm. Warm. Rehearsed. 2 weeks later, his response landed, and I understood the strategy. He didn't fight the DNA test directly, not yet. Instead, his attorney filed a motion requesting a full custody and fitness evaluation of me. Citing my high-trauma occupation, my extended absences at accident scenes, my documented postpartum strain, and, this was the phrase that kept me up at night, escalating paranoid behavior, including surveillance of the respondent and confrontation of unrelated third parties, the Richmond doorstep. Marianne had told him a strange woman came to the house, and he had folded my worst day into a court filing as evidence of my instability. Every true thing I'd done now read like the symptoms of a woman coming apart. That's the genius of a man who has spent 9 years controlling the narrative. He doesn't have to lie. He just has to arrange your truths in his order. Wilmington chose its side fast. He was the doctor who saved children's hearts and stayed late with scared parents. I was the wife nobody really knew, the one with the government badge and the closed-off face. 2 neighbors stopped waving. A NICU follow-up nurse got quiet and careful around me, all except Ilsa Braun, the night nurse from Eli's first weeks, who squeezed my arm in a hallway and said, "I chart everything, honey. Everything." I didn't understand yet what she was offering me, then it reached my job. My supervisor called me in, apologetic, and slid a letter across the desk. An anonymous concern had been filed questioning whether my personal situation was compromising my objectivity in the field. It went nowhere. My record was clean and the review said so in writing, but it was a flare fired at my livelihood, and we both knew who'd lit it. The lowest point had a location. Level 3 of the hospital parking deck, a Tuesday in June, when Colin fell into step beside me like we were still a couple. He didn't threaten me. Men like Colin don't threaten. He said he hated seeing me like this. He said evaluations get ugly, that judges see a stressed, isolated mother with a dangerous job and they make safe choices. Then he put his hand on my car door and said, softly, withdraw the petition, Reese. Sign the settlement, and all of this pressure just goes away. I'll be generous. You keep him. I keep my life. Everybody's easy. I looked at my husband and finally saw the design of the whole machine. He didn't hate Eli. Eli was a paperwork problem. Acknowledging him would ripple through systems Colin needed to keep separated, and I still didn't fully know why. I said I'd think about it. Then I sat in my car and wrote down every word with the date and time, the way I've logged witness statements for 11 years, and I photographed the deck's level sign through my windshield. Yolanda added it to the file with one dry comment, an innocent man doesn't pay you to stop asking if he's the father, but the offer had done its damage. The evaluation went forward. A court-appointed evaluator sat in my living room with a clipboard while I laid out Eli's NICU discharge summaries. His feeding logs, his pediatric appointments, every date accounted for, exhibits in defense of my own motherhood. She asked if I had a support system. I opened my mouth to say yes and realized I couldn't name a single person I'd let inside my life in 3 months. That night broke me open in the only way that ended up mattering. I called Theo. Then my mother. They were at my kitchen table within the hour, hurt that I'd shut them out and there anyway, and I did the thing I'd never once done at any crash site. I handed over the whole file and said the words, "I can't carry this alone." Theo went through the wall in my garage like it was a chart review. And Theo, who has never let a silence sit, wouldn't let this one sit either. If Colin's history was clean, he said, let's read the history. He started pulling old residency program materials, alumni newsletters, the fossil record of a medical career. 3 nights later he called me, and his voice had a strange hum in it. He'd found a fellowship class photo from a Virginia program, 15 years back. Front row, 3rd from the left, unmistakably my husband. Younger, same smile. But the caption under that face didn't say Colin Ashford, it said Colin M. Hastings. The name change was real, legal, and filed 11 years ago, 1 year before he moved to Wilmington. The record for Colin Ashford was clean because Colin Ashford was only 11 years old. Everything before that belonged to another man. A name change order is a public court record. Once you know to ask for it, it stops hiding. The order was granted 11 years ago in a Virginia circuit court, one line of which rearranged my entire case. Petitioner Colin Michael Hastings, requesting to be known henceforth as Colin Michael Ashford. No fraud alleged, no crime committed by the change itself. Plenty of people rename themselves. But nobody searches marriage registries for a man who no longer exists. I ran the search again with the old name, and there it was, like it had been waiting for me the whole time. A marriage license, Richmond, 13 years ago. Colin Michael Hastings and Mary Ann. I checked for a divorce decree in every jurisdiction his paper trail had ever touched. There wasn't one. There was no annulment, no dissolution, nothing. The marriage that predated me by 7 years had never legally ended. Which meant mine may never have legally begun. I sat with that document for a long time. And then I did something Yolanda later called the smartest move I made in the whole case, though I didn't do it to be smart. I did it because I remembered a door clicking shut in my face, and I remembered thinking, she's me. I made copies of exactly 2 things, the Hastings marriage license and Colin's notarized affidavit swearing my son wasn't his, and I mailed them to the Colonial in Richmond with no letter. No accusations, no demands. Just a sticky note with my first name and my number. If someone had handed me proof instead of a speech that day in the NICU, I'd have wanted it clean, without commentary. Evidence respects people. Arguments don't. 9 days of silence. Then, on a Thursday night with Eli asleep on my chest, my phone lit up with a Richmond number, and a voice I'd heard exactly once before said, "The license is real." I called the courthouse myself. A long breath. He told me he'd changed his name because of a stalker at his old hospital. I helped him pick it. Another breath, thinner. "What was the date on your wedding?" I told her. "June, 6 years ago." She made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Because it was the sound of a woman doing the same arithmetic I'd done at a soccer field fence. Then she said, "We were at my sister's lake rental that week." He left for 2 days. A conference. A pause. I have the calendar. I have every calendar. I keep them all. We met the following Saturday at a diner off I-95, almost exactly halfway between our two versions of him, and Marianne walked in carrying a canvas tote bag full of family calendars like a woman delivering evidence to a grand jury, which, in a way, she was. We didn't hug. We didn't cry at first. We ordered coffee neither of us drank and laid our lives out side by side on a laminate table, her kitchen calendars against my garage timeline. 13 years of her ink against 9 years of my receipts, and they interlocked like gears. Every conference I could name, she could place him at a recital or a birthday. Every holiday he'd missed with me, he'd kept with her, and every one he'd missed with her, he'd spent with me. 2 women, 1 schedule, 0 collisions. At some point she took a napkin and wrote 2 dates on it, her anniversary above mine, and pushed it to the middle of the table, and we both stared at the 6-inch gap between them like it was the wreckage field itself. That's when we cried, quietly, in a highway diner, 2 strangers grieving the same man who had never fully existed. She asked about Eli. I told her about the blank line. And I watched a mother's fury arrive behind her eyes. Her fight wasn't simple. Testifying meant detonating her children's world with their father's name on the charge. Staying silent meant raising them inside his lie. She stirred her cold coffee for a long minute and then said the sentence that ended Colin Ashford, "My kids are going to learn the truth someday no matter what I do. The only thing I control is whether they learn I stood up when I knew." The court-ordered DNA results had arrived 2 days before that meeting. I'd made myself wait to open them, and in the end I read the report in my parked car by the dashboard light, 1 number on 1 line. Probability of paternity, 99. 99%. Under North Carolina law, that number would put Colin's name on Eli's birth certificate whether he ever touched a pen or not. And it did something else. It converted a cruel piece of paper into a criminal one, because a sworn affidavit denying paternity, notarized in advance, signed under penalty of perjury, had just collided with a laboratory. After that, it stopped being grief and became assembly. Yolanda built the package the way I build a final report, every claim pinned to a document. The valid Hastings marriage license, never dissolved, bigamy. The DNA result against the affidavit, perjury. The hospital benefits file, employee 40871, carrying a spouse through years of open enrollment while legally married to someone whose name didn't match mine, insurance fraud. The name change itself, lawful alone, damning in context. Marianne signed her statement in Richmond and filed to end her marriage the same week Yolanda filed our complaints, 1 packet to the district attorney's office, 1 to the state medical board, both stamped within days of each other. 2 wives moving like 1 investigator. The medical board's confirmation letter arrived on a Tuesday. Receipt acknowledged, matter assigned for review. I stood at my kitchen table, at the exact spot where I'd once stared at a blank father line, and checked the date against the one event all of coastal Carolina already had on its calendar. The board opened its file 3 days before Colin was due on stage in a ballroom. Accepting a regional award as the Coastal Pediatric Champion of the Year, I did not go to the gala. I want that on the record, because the version of this story where I stand at the back of the ballroom watching him fall is the version Colin's lawyers were praying for. I stayed home with Eli and a stack of laundry, and I know what happened the way investigators always know, from statements, from photographs, from people who were in the room. The ballroom was hotel elegant, gold uplighting and a step-and-repeat banner with the hospital foundation's logo. Colin gave his acceptance remarks about how every child deserves someone who refuses to give up on them, and people told me later that the applause was long and warm and that he glowed in it the way he'd glowed at that soccer field. Then came the reception, champagne on trays, donors in a loose orbit around him. That's where the man in the gray suit found him. Not security, not police, just a licensed process server doing the most ordinary job in America. He waited politely for a conversation to end, confirmed, Dr. Colin Ashford, and placed a manila envelope in his hand. Inside were 2 documents. A notice from the State Medical Board, summary suspension of his license pending a hearing on charges including fraud and conduct involving moral turpitude. And a criminal summons from the district attorney. Bigamy. Insurance fraud. Perjury on a sworn affidavit of parentage, witnesses said. Colin smiled at the envelope. That's the detail I can't shake. He smiled, reflexively, because men like Colin have spent their lives being handed things, awards, referrals, benefit of the doubt. It took him the length of the first page to understand that this was the one delivery his charm couldn't sign for. He didn't shout. He set down his champagne, told the nearest donor something about a patient matter, and walked out through the kitchen exit. The trophy stayed on the table. After that, the collapse ran on institutional time, which is slower than movies and far more merciless. The hospital placed him on administrative leave within the week, standard procedure once a license is suspended, announced in a 2-sentence internal memo that said nothing and told everyone everything. The local paper ran the story 11 days later, careful and lawyered, a prominent Wilmington pediatric cardiologist facing bigamy and fraud charges, 2 marriages, 2 states, a name change. Marianne and I had made exactly one joint request through our attorneys, and to the paper's credit, it held no photographs of children, no names of minors, nothing that would follow her son and daughter into a school hallway. The town that had stopped waving at me started calling me. I didn't call back. I wasn't collecting apologies. I was raising a baby. One Tuesday that fall, Theo texted me a photo from the hospital lobby. A maintenance worker on a ladder, taking down the framed portrait of Dr. Ashford that had hung by the cardiology wing for years, the one where he's holding a stethoscope to a teddy bear's chest. No ceremony. Just a man with a screwdriver and an empty rectangle of darker paint where a reputation used to hang. Every disaster leaves a mark like that somewhere. The medical board hearing came in early spring, almost a year to the week after Eli was born, in a state office building with bad carpet and good stenographers. I attended every session. I sat in the second row of the gallery and I kept my face exactly as flat as I keep it at accident scenes, because I had promised myself one thing: he would not get a reaction to perform against. The board's counsel didn't need theatrics. They had his own paper. They read his conference itineraries into the record next to Marianne's calendars. They read his mileage reimbursements, line by line, the ones he'd filed for trips he'd sworn were professional travel, and matched them to weekends in Richmond. 11 years of self-documentation, all that vanity filing, laid out as a timeline he could not dispute because he was the one who had built it. There is a special silence that falls over a room when a man is confronted not with an accusation but with his own handwriting. I know that silence from cockpit voice recorders. It's the sound of no remaining explanations, Marianne testified on the second day. She wore gray, spoke evenly, and answered every question with dates. 13 years of marriage, never dissolved. The stalker story he'd told her about the name change. The night she learned her husband's other wedding had happened during her sister's Lake Week. She looked at him exactly once, when counsel asked her to identify the man she had married as Colin Hastings, and Colin looked back at her with an expression I'd been trying to name for a year. It wasn't guilt. It was bewilderment. The genuine confusion of a man who had loved being loved in two places and could not, even now, locate the moment that had become a crime. He never wanted to hurt anyone. He wanted to be everything to everyone. Indefinitely, and the arithmetic had finally been audited. At one point he scanned the gallery and found me. I gave him nothing. Not anger, not tears, not the flinch he was searching for. Just the level, note-taking gaze I'd give a debris field, and I watched something in him finally go out, the board revoked. The criminal case moved toward a plea. The family court, armed with the DNA result, entered the order I'd fought a year for: paternity established, Colin Michael Ashford, father of record, child support ordered, garnished, non-negotiable. The man who had sworn my son didn't exist would now pay for his existence every month, by law, under the name he'd hidden behind. I thought it was over. Then Yolanda called on a Friday afternoon with a tone I'd never heard from her, somewhere between disgust and grim amusement. His attorney filed something this morning, she said. Timed for sentencing. He's petitioning for supervised visitation with Eli. The man who notarized his son away before the boy drew breath wanted a judge to watch him hold him. Yolanda saw the play immediately, and once she said it out loud, so did I. The visitation petition wasn't about Eli. It was scheduled 2 weeks before sentencing, which meant it was about the judge. A man petitioning to know his son photographs well in a pre-sentencing memo. Remorse, growth, a father trying. It was the parking deck offer all over again. Just aimed at a different audience. The hearing lasted under an hour. His attorney spoke about reflection, about a man who had lost everything and wanted to do one thing right. Colin wore contrition the way he'd worn every other role, precisely fitted. Then Yolanda stood, and she didn't argue. She entered one exhibit and read one date into the record. The affidavit denying paternity, notarized 14 days before Eli was born. She let the math sit in the room. The petitioner didn't reject this child in a moment of crisis, Your Honor. He scheduled it. He made an appointment, drove to a notary, and swore this boy away before he had a birthday. The only thing that has changed since is that the petitioner got caught. The judge granted me sole legal and physical custody. Support obligations continued in full, surviving the plea he took a month later, the one that ended his license for good and traded prison time for supervised probation, restitution, and a felony record under the name Ashford, forever cross-referenced to Hastings. And the court added a provision I hadn't asked for but will be grateful for until I die: no contact and no access, unless Eli himself, as an adult, chooses to consent. The door wasn't slammed. It was handed to my son, hinges and key, to open or not when he's grown. That felt right. Colin took Eli's choices away before he was born. The law gave the last choice back to Eli. Colin left the coast that summer. I heard secondhand that he moved somewhere inland, works in medical consulting now, the kind of job where nobody checks the wall for a license. I don't track him. The support arrives by garnishment on the 1st of the month, which is the only conversation we have, and it says everything. A year out, the debris field has grown over. I was promoted to lead investigator in the fall, and the first thing I did was put a photo of Eli on my desk, which the old me, the one who kept every compartment sealed, would never have done. Theo has dinner with us on Sundays. My mother taught Eli to say "uh-oh," which he now deploys constantly and with great satisfaction. Marianne and I still talk, not weekly, not sentimentally, but the way two people talk when they've read the same black box. Her kids are in counseling and doing better than anyone had a right to hope. She sold the Colonial. She kept the calendars. Eli's amended birth certificate came in a state envelope, and I'll tell you the truth, I cried harder over that piece of paper than I cried over any of it. Every line filled. Mother. Father. No white rectangle. Whatever that name costs him to read someday, he will never stand in a records office wondering if half of him was ever written down, and someday is handled too. I did the last thing an investigator does when the work is finished. I wrote the final report. Not for a court, for Eli. every fact, every date, every choice, mine included, the mistakes and all, written by hand and sealed in an envelope marked with his 18th birthday. It sits in the evidence box on my closet shelf with the affidavit, the license, the diner napkin with 2 anniversaries on it. The box isn't labeled with a case number. It's labeled with his birthday, because that's what this case was always about. I think about his father less than I expected to. When I do, it's usually this: some men spend their whole lives running from a signature. I made sure my son will never have to chase one.